All right, good evening. Welcome to UPARS Los Angeles. It is, September of 2015. We are very lucky to have with us a woman who has been in the remote viewing field for her whole life, really, because this started for Angela Thompson-Smith when she was just a little child. She found that she could astral project out-of-body experiences. Some of you may be familiar with that. So, as a child, she didn't realize that this talent could be harnessed, but as she grew older, she found that other people were doing this, and she came under the tutelage of a few people, including Lynn Buchanan. And she worked with several noted people in the field of remote viewing and received training. So she took her talent and actually honed it to something even more useful. And I think there are a few people in the audience I've talked to tonight who also seem to have that skill. So it's not something that's totally uncommon, although it's very unique and uncommon to most of us. Angela comes to us from Boulder City, which is right outside of Las Vegas. She was very kind to come out here and speak to us tonight. So I'd like you to give her a warm welcome. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you very much for inviting me out this evening, and I'm delighted to be here and share some of the information that I have, and I'll be available for questions afterwards, so if you'll keep your questions until the end, because there's a lot of very interesting information to go through. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and a very sweet gentleman down there is going to advance the slides when I give him the cue. We don't have a remote, unfortunately, but we will survive. We will get through this. So, what does it mean by high strangeness remote viewing? It sounds like you've all heard of remote viewing. High strangeness is something that's using remote viewing for topics that are not always sanctioned, both by the remote viewing communities and the general public. So in fact, anything off-planet, anything that's anomalous, such as ghost hunting, unusual personal experiences, all of these have been discouraged in the remote viewing field. But when you start looking back at the history of remote viewing, there are instances where the very people who developed remote viewing were doing high strangeness remote viewing projects, and I'm going to cover some of those. So if we can go to the next slide. As I've said, remote viewing is a trained and disciplined practice that provides the viewer with a virtual organizer in which to record their access data. Viewers are trained in several different methods to access information from the past, the present, and even the future. Remote viewing is a 40-plus year history of research and development, and it's the trained ability to obtain hidden or unknown information about a location, event, person, or object using something other than the known five senses. And we talk about the five senses, but actually there are 27, 52. There are many, many different senses that we have as humans. What kinds of things is remote viewing traditionally used for? I have a small group called the Nevada Remote Viewing Group, who are, most of them have been trained by me, and they all have regular day jobs. So they're a bit like a volunteer firefighting team that I can call on them, and if they're available, I can send them out projects. And some of the projects that we've worked on were, the first one up there is the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and we were asked to help locate 2 humanitarian aid workers who had been lost when the Hotel Montana collapsed. And first of all, I was only told there was one gentleman that was missing. So I went looking for him, and the other members of the team looked for him. And I found 2 men The one Caucasian gentleman, tall, lean, bearded man. And then I saw with him a tall African-American gentleman who was dressed in a green kind of a jumpsuit that was bringing the body of the first man into another area. So I thought, well, at least there's one person alive in the rubble. But I didn't know about this second man. Later I learned that they were actually looking for two humanitarian aid workers. And the second gentleman was the second person that they were looking for. Unfortunately, they both passed in the earthquake. The second gentleman succumbed to his injuries. So one of the interesting things in the first project, the Haiti, was I kept seeing these big bullseyes. And so I asked, and I said, well, this is probably something we call AOL, analytical overlay. Your left brain is trying to make sense of the data. But it turned out that they were three intact helicopter pads that looked like a bullseye from above. So that was a definite hit. The gentleman over on the right was a DJ out of Denver, had moved to LA. Okay. Right, I have a soft voice, I will try and project. So this gentleman had been missing for a month. He'd moved out to LA to look after his father, and then he joined up with another man, and they were going to sail around down to the Caribbean, and they were going to set up a restaurant. So there were lots of plans that they were making. And then suddenly, this gentleman went missing. And so we were asked by a friend of the DJ if we could look for him and help. And first of all, we didn't know what the project was because we were just given what's called a coordinate, which is just like a case number, a street address. So it was a series, an alphanumeric that was part of the project. So all we had was this alphanumeric, and what I saw was brackish water, seaweed, a net-like pattern, a nearby land mass, and the fact that I thought that this person had died. I don't like to tell that to clients, but so I try and couch it in vague terms like the person's lying there not breathing, white, not moving, and let them make their own judgments. But the friend did not want to believe that this friend had passed away. So then we gave the information, the coordinate then to the Nevada Remote Viewing Group. They all came back with very similar information, and eventually this gentleman's body was brought up out of the ocean off of Catalina Island, and he'd been shot in the head. And by the colleague that they were going to go around the Bahamas. What was interesting was that the LA Sheriff's Office got involved in this case, and they were asking us the group questions. And eventually, when the perpetrator was caught, and we had to wait 6 years while the trial went on, we were not allowed to talk about anything about this case for 6 years. And so at the end of the 6 years, when the perpetrator got sentenced, then we could talk about the case. And the LA Sheriff's Office came forward when a reporter wanted to write up the case, and they actually gave interviews saying how amazed they were at the data. And this was published in the Las Vegas Sun. So, I mean, that, I think, was a first to have that confirmation from a sheriff's department that they'd actually used remote viewing data. The bottom picture is of Amelia Earhart, and a couple of years ago we were tasked to look for Amelia and see what happened to her. Nobody knows what happened to her. The first data that came in was that she and her co-pilot had landed their plane on a sandbank on an atoll, and then they'd gone inland a little bit, and then they were picked up by the Japanese in a rowboat and taken out to a ship that had square portholes, which seemed to me very, very strange because I'd never heard of a ship with square portholes before. The remote viewers, because we brought in other remote viewers then, and they followed the ship back to the island of Saipan and to Garapan prison. The Japanese at that time had control over Saipan, and we got lots and lots of information. And I don't have time to go into the whole project here, but we've since been receiving a lot of validation of the viewing, including the ship with square portholes, which was a Japanese type of ship that was operating around that time in the late 1930s. So, which is very gratifying to get feedback. So what else is remote viewing, just classical remote viewing, used for? Well, I've been asked to remote view the form and function of subatomic particles, healing plants. We were given a project where we were given groups of 10 coordinates, they're often numeric, of plants, and the remote viewer's job was to remote view which were sick plants and which were healthy plants. And that was a very interesting project. We were able to get 80% and 100% towards the end of that project. Treasure hunting, which I don't do anymore because it's so hit or miss. Because even if you get really good information for the person that's asked for the data, there's no guarantee that you're going to see any of it. So I don't do treasure hunting. Missing people, terrorist cases. There was, after 9/11, many of us remote viewers were informally tasked, which means that people from certain agencies and bureaus contacted remote viewers for information. And I did some work for somebody I only ever knew as Navy Frank, and gave some information. But of course, with that kind of viewing, you never ever get feedback. So I didn't know how well I did or not. Business and industry are quietly looking at remote viewing. I worked for a businessman in New York, a Fifth Avenue businessman, for 9 years doing remote viewing. And I was his secret. So I kept asking him, are you going to recommend me to other business people? He says, no. No, that's it. You're my secret. Yeah. So we worked together for 9 years, and as we'll go on to see later, he tasked me with a very, very interesting project. When we look at high strangeness remote viewing, this is anything out of the ordinary. We've got here the rings of Saturn, we've got Jupiter, and we've got the Moon, and all of these have been subject to remote viewing projects by various people, including Ingo Swann. In remote viewing, until a project receives feedback, it's deemed speculative. So unless a project has readily available feedback, it usually isn't tackled, or unless the feedback is going to be available in the near future. But I've had to wait 11 years, sometimes 20 years for feedback. That doesn't invalidate the remote viewing that I do. So especially if a project has a high strangeness factor, it's discouraged in the remote viewing field. However, Ingo Swann, the father of remote viewing, did some of the very first high strangeness remote viewing. He remote viewed Jupiter. And what he did was he found that Jupiter had a ring around it, which at the time was ridiculed because the photographs of it at the time didn't show the ring. So his work was ridiculed and invalidated. And he also did some very interesting work remote viewing the moon. And we're still getting some feedback on that. So now there's been research done. There have been various spacecraft that have been launched and have gone out and viewed Jupiter. And in fact, there is a ring. There are several rings around Jupiter. They're called the Gossamer rings because they're really very, very faint. And so the flybys have actually confirmed rings around Jupiter that were seen by Ingo Swann many, many years ago. That's one of the craft. So the official version now is discovered in 1979. Jupiter's rings were a surprise, as they're composed of small dark particles that are difficult to see except when backlit by the sun. Data from the Galileo spacecraft indicate that Jupiter's ring system may be formed by dust kicked up as meteoroids smash into the giant planet and smash into the small innermost moons. So there's one instance of the father of remote viewing doing high strangeness remote viewing, which today is discouraged by some of the more orthodox remote viewing trainers. And this is a depiction of the rings. In 1983, I read about Ingo Swann and I read about his view of the moon, a view of Jupiter. And even though this was fully front-loaded, I decided to do my own viewing. So in '83, using a stream of consciousness type of remote viewing, which is called extended remote viewing, or ERV, which is just sending your mind to a location and writing down what you perceive. I did 3 tries to look at Jupiter. So the first time, all I saw was a mauve-purple haze. I didn't really see anything strongly. Then I went back in again in April, and I saw a liquid resembling water. In a lake or pond, it was thick and oily, and I perceived that it could change its molecular structure to avoid freezing or boiling. And then I went back again and looked at, I saw mountains composed of this quartz-like material. Now, we don't know if that is really there or not. And a purple kind of atmosphere, and fields of flexible quartz crystals. Now we found that NASA has come out with some flyby material, some data, that in fact there is a substance on Jupiter that resembles water. It's described as an ocean. The atmospheric pressure and temperature compresses the Jovian atmosphere, which is mostly hydrogen and helium, into a liquid. And this gives Jupiter the largest ocean in the solar system, an ocean made of hydrogen instead of water. So I thought pretty pleased that one of my perceptions had been validated. And next year there's going to be another flyby of Jupiter, so we'll see what else they find on Jupiter. In 1994, I was commissioned to look at the rings of Saturn. This was a partially front-loaded project, which means I was given a little bit of information, which was I was going to look at the rings of Saturn and look at how they were formed. And I was given a few questions about that. What I didn't know was that the people who gave me the questions were interested in Bergeland's book, Anomalies in the Rings of Saturn. And I'd never heard of the book, I'd not read the book, I didn't know about the book at the time. But I did the project, and what I perceived was something very puzzling. In the rings, I found these very large tubular metallic structures that seemed to be filtering the rocks in the rings. And then every now and again, another tubular thing would come and unload all of this material. So I'm going, okay, this is sort of unusual, but when I'm doing remote viewing, I give the client what I get, regardless of how unusual it sounds. So this was commissioned by a California group called Intuition Services, and it was what's called legally blind, which means you're not totally blind to the project. You're not just getting an alphanumeric coordinate, but there is some information, such as I was looking at the formation of the rings. And so I perceived these anomalies that I described as mining craft in the rings. So, and then I did further viewing of the rings themselves and some of what I perceived as how they were formed. That's the Cassini probe, which went out in 2004. So in 2004, the Cassini probe reached Saturn and returned data to Earth. And this data provided feedback and verification of the perceptions from 1994 regarding the formation and progression of the ring. So I got a lot of feedback from the Cassini material, which matched a lot of the things that I had said, such as that gaps in the rings were cyclic, that sometimes they closed up and sometimes they opened again. And also in 2014, the Cassini images were collated by a private group who call themselves Street Cap 1. I don't know who they're run by. I will one day. Hopefully I'll meet the gentleman that runs it. And he showed many of the static and moving anomalies within the rings. He got hold of untouched NASA photographs of the rings of Saturn and was able to find lots of anomalies within the rings that were both moving and were static. And sometimes it takes 20 years to get feedback. That's one of the street cap pictures, and it's very hard to see from this picture, but there are others that he's put up online on all the videos there that show these anomalies in the rings. Now to get a little bit closer to home, in 2002, I got an email from a senior NASA manager in Houston who initially wanted me to do a missing person case, but the girl was found the next day, so that didn't appear, that we didn't have to do that project. But this gentleman said, well, there is a way you could perhaps help the organization by remote viewing. We have a problem. He said, this is an informal project. This is not sanctioned by NASA at all. This is just from me. He said, I'll pass it up the chain, see if anyone's interested, but maybe you and your viewers can take a look and see if we can find an answer. And he suggested we might help them identify the cause, remedies, and consequences of defects within the shuttle flow liners. 10 viewers were blind tasked. They only had the alphanumeric coordinate, and then they were later front-loaded if they chose. And all they were told was, this project involves a device. Tell me about the device. What's happening with this device? So the 5 hidden questions were paired with 5 questions. So we asked, and the viewers had none of this. This was all hidden in a folder in my office. And you say there might be some telepathic overlay. That's possible. But this was so way out there that for them to pick up what they did was incredible in itself. So we wanted to know the cause of the cracks in the shuttle flow liners, the progression of the cracks, possible effects if no repairs were made, describe the repair techniques, how effective will these repair techniques be, and so if nothing's done, what will be the consequences? And that report was given July 22, 2002 to this manager. The viewers described the cracks in the device, engineers working on the device. A hangar-like space described the flow of liquid, pipes and tubes, leakage of materials, and one viewer even named the shuttle. She said, it's just off the top of my head, this is what came to me. The viewers also described factory defects, deliberate obsolescence and overuse, and that there was no intent to fix the defects, and that the defects would not be fixed. The viewers indicated there were several devices with the same problem. It would be a disaster not to address the problem, and continued use of the device would result in injury or worse. Shortly thereafter, the shuttle fleet was grounded for 4 months for inspections, regardless of our data. And despite this, on February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded on re-entry. When I saw that on television, my heart went out, and I thought, what do I do? Do I call this manager? What do I say to him? I can't say, told you so. You can't do that. So I called with compassion and said how sorry I was to hear this. And he was quite upset. He said he had tried to send our data up the chain, and nobody would listen because it came from remote viewers. If we'd said we were engineers or that we were even artists, perhaps we would have had a better reception. And it was very sad to see that outcome. Let's go a little bit further afield. Let's go off-planet. I've mentioned before that I was working with a financial sponsor, working for him for 9 years. And in the middle of that, around 2006, he came up with a very unusual project. He said, can you talk to aliens? So I was like, well, maybe. I'm not quite sure how I would do that, but there maybe is a way. So what I did was I figured, well, if you were to go out into the Amazon and find a tribe of indigenous folks out there who had some knowledge of Caucasian life and Western life, that perhaps spoke a little English but were still largely living their own life, their own ways, what kinds of questions would you ask them? So I searched online and I found several sociological questionnaires that were used in that way, that were taken out into the Amazon and to places where Westerners had not really reached and impacted the people. So I adapted those to a questionnaire that I said, okay, to my client, I passed it by him. I said, is this something you would like? And he said, yeah. He said, let's start off with 5 races, 5 ET races, and see what we get. So full of trepidation, I typed what I would do. I type all this up into my computer, all the questions. And I'm not a medium. I'm not somebody that lets some disembodied ET or disembodied spirit take over my body and my voice. I wanted it to treat this as a straight interview. I was going to interview these races. So we started off with 1 race, went through the questions, and I sat there first of all with the very first project, which was with the small greys, and said, okay, is there a grey out there that would like to talk to me? And an answer came back. So, typing it in. Asked the next question. More information came in. And part of me was thinking, well, I don't feel like I'm making this up because this information is something different than what I would type, particularly when they gave answers that were totally opposite to what I would think. For example, the Greys consider abductions as beneficial to humans, and that the hybrids that are formed, from the abduction process are ambassadors that fly out all over the universe and are ambassadors, and they take some of our human genes out into space. I'd never heard of that before, but I wrote it all down. And by the end of the year, we had interviewed 18 races. And so at the end of that year, we had maybe a half dozen more races lined up to interview. The client came under some harassment or harassment, and he got spooked. He said, no, let's just put this in the files and let's get back to business remote viewing, because he was trying to sell his business and a lot of other work that was going on. And so that got put back into my files for 7 years. Because I asked him, I said, this is wonderful stuff, we should publish this. He said, later on maybe, but for now, just hang on to it. Well, eventually, he sold his business, he sold a farm that he had, he moved out to Australia, and he shredded, he told me, all of his remote viewing stuff. He just wanted a fresh start in another country. So I was left, and in remote viewing, I had the copyright of this material. So a few years ago I thought, well, I would love to put this out to some of the community and see what they think of it and see whether it would be worth publishing. So how many of you know of or know Donald Ware? A few of you, yeah. Donald Ware has a mailing list, an email mailing list of about 600 people. And he was one of the people I had contacted with this question about where can I put this material. So he said, why don't you send me one interview a week and I'll post it out to my group. Well, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Wow, this is amazing stuff. This should be published. This is information that needs to get out to the public. So I said, okay, well, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that, but in the process of putting this out to his group, a colleague of mine that I've known for many, many years, Scott Jones, came forward, and I knew him from back in Princeton days. I worked at the Pear Lab at Princeton for 5 years. And he said, well, I'm getting up in years now. He's 84. He said, I've got a lot of information. He's been in the field for decades. He said, I've got a lot of information that needs to be shared. How about we write a book together? So that's how Voices from the Cosmos came into existence. So stuff that had been was accomplished acquired over a year, sat in my files for 7 years. We put that book together in 10 months and then spent a week going through doing all of the editing. And it's now actually got honorable mentions in several book festivals, which we're very pleased about. It hasn't won any major prizes yet, but it's early days. So the question was, what if we could talk to our cosmic neighbors? What would they tell us? At the beginning, as I mentioned, 2006, we started this project. So he asked, could we communicate with a series of ETs? And 1 year later, 18 races had been interviewed. And I call them interviews because that's what they are. There's the question, there's the answer, sometimes clarifying questions were asked, but basically these are interviews. And then we wrote them up into Voices from the Cosmos. These were the races that were interviewed, the large and small greys, and these were one representative from each of these races. The Nordics, who also called themselves the whites, the hooded reptilian, the indigo hybrid, the orbs, the oranges, the angels, the light beings, and the dark ones, who you don't want around you. The Anaka, the Lyrians, the Ral, the Duvel, the Syrians, the Aldebarans, the Anunnaki. Then the client said, why can't we get these races talking to each other? So then we did a couple of dialogues, and we had the races not only talking to each other, but talking about each other, which was fascinating. And many of the races towards the end were then scheduled to be interviewed, and we actually did a couple of site visits using remote viewing out to where these races were actually resident. So this was a unique project that required a unique protocol. As far as I know, there's not been very much done in this field. A sociological was approached as if the ETs were similar to an indigenous Earth race, which I've already described. And so a collation was made of all of these responses. And you'll see at the back, recently a colleague of mine put together all of the responses from the ETs, from the interviews. Down one side of the spreadsheet are all of the races, and then going along the spreadsheet are all of their responses under several headings. These were some of the categories of questions that we asked. A description of each of the races, their purpose, their role in abductions, role in the confederations, cooperation, communication, implants, home location if there was one, travel and social structure. If they had arts or writing or even singing or music, what changes they went through, what they considered as death or reincarnation, their populations, relationships to humans and others. Many of them consider humans as limited. That was one of the words that kept coming through. And I've thought about that. I was a little bit annoyed by that at first, thinking, well, you know, we're not really that limited. We're really very wonderfully made. But in terms of ET progress, we've got a long way to go. So their predictive ability, shape-shifting ability, perceptions of human abilities, belief in a God or creator, and concepts of time. So here are some. I've chosen 5 of the races. I don't have time to go through all of the races, but these are 5. So the small greys can move through dense materials. This is what they've told us. They consider abductions beneficial to humans, consider humans limited. They are not part of the Confederation. They're all connected to one mind. The hybrids are explorers. Grey minds work in large maps. They work with large greys, Nordics, reptilians, and others on the craft. The large greys are nocturnal. They all share thoughts. They mine hydrocarbons and boron. They're not part of the Confederation. They do mind-to-mind communication with humans, work with small greys and others. Their social structure is arranged in ninths, and I questioned that. They said, yeah, we're produced in ninths. There are 9 of them at a time, you know, so 9 is a very strong number for them. They can, again, consider humans limited, and they're closely involved with abductions. And a lot of this is already known. So there's a lot is known already, but there's lots of other information that came through from the interviews. The Nordics are most like human in form. They're able to bilocate and transfer, because we asked them, well, if you become damaged or die, what happens? Is there an afterlife? And they said, no, we just sent a thought form to another body. So, which was very interesting. They are part of the Confederation. Some may be Earth resident, and some you may have met some in your daily life and you wouldn't even know. Time is not linear for Nordics. Time is multidimensional. They're explorers, and they interact with many other races. And the Anunnaki, if you remember, Sitchin looked at a lot of the Sumerian writings and wrote out what he felt to be who the Anunnaki were. And what the Anunnaki say, well, Sitchin got some of it wrong. The Sumerians got some of it wrong. So their interviews were very interesting. They are present off Earth, and they're sometimes resident. When I was doing some of the interviews, I had a gut feeling that I was talking to an Earth resident Anunnaki. So I said, "Are you here on Earth?" And they said, "Yes." So that was a very interesting revelation. They're egalitarian in group function, which means that even though they're not all telepathic or all working on a hive mind, they are all equal. They're available for contact and communication. They do not expect humans to change. They consider humans their children, not their slaves, and they interact with many other races. And then orbs. We tend to think of orbs as traveling around and perhaps, in an unthinking, unfeeling way, but they are actually sentient beings. They are carriers of information for many other races. They are part of the Confederation. Orb communication is multi-meaning, which means when I was interviewing them, it was like interviewing a thesaurus, because for each response there were multiple words coming through and I had to grasp at the closest meaning. They are everywhere in the cosmos. They are altruistic and they subsume their own interests. They can materialize and dematerialize. They can be called by humans, but not all the races respect the orbs. Some of them think of them as those poor things, but the orbs themselves consider themselves to be a sentient, noble race. So I want to leave this part. We've got another small part to go through, but I want to leave you with a quote from Ingo Swann. For remote viewing to have a more positive influence on our future, it must be found useful at the grassroots level, where goal-oriented individuals can perceive its application for the common good. Only those individuals who've made some effort to understand it as a personal experience will be in a position to comprehend more fully the potential of it. They are the advanced thinkers who will redefine the boundaries of consciousness. I really like that quote. So, are you up for a little bit of remote viewing? Yes. Okay. I'm going to ask you to use a stream of consciousness remote viewing, which means in a moment I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, try and enter into a quiet space. I'm going to give you the coordinate, and there is a little bit of front loading. You are legally blind in this project, which means I'm going to tell you this can be somewhere out in the cosmos. So that gives you a lot of scope. And the coordinate, when you're ready, is F681K. What I want you to do is to move to that coordinate in the cosmos, and just for a few minutes, look around there as much as you can, see what you can perceive. So I'm going to give you a few minutes here, and I will call you back in a moment. Now that was a very short session, I know. But if any of you had perceived anything, if you'd like to raise your hand and let me know what you perceived. Did anybody get anything? Yeah.
Jagged cliffs jutting out over each other.
Okay. So jagged cliffs, large jagged cliffs sort of jutting out over each other. Anything else? One person back here, can you yell?
A large metallic structure of sorts.
Large metallic structure.
Yeah, similar look. I try not to name it while I was looking at it, but after the fact, it kind of, I guess, appeared somewhat like there were certain shapes similar to like the Starship Enterprise, kind of like roundish shapes.
Roundish shapes similar to the Enterprise.
Yeah.
Okay. It's hard to see. Yeah. The gentleman in the black shirt first.
I saw triangular, pointy things.
Triangular pointy things.
Dark blue, some silver metallic, that seemed to be like mercury, and that's about it.
Some metallic shapes. And, yeah.
Funnel shapes, things like
Funnel shapes. Okay. The gentleman in front of him.
Yeah, I saw some look like wheels or cogs in machines spinning. Kind of maybe similar to what we saw, but really like machine wheels spinning, not connected necessarily to anything, but a couple of different ones.
Okay. Okay. So machine wheels spinning. There's a lady over there next to him. No? Okay. This gentleman.
We picked up the moon,
The moon. Okay.
the structures on it, the bases that are interplanetary.
So bases and structures on a moon.
It's hollow, manufactured,
Something manufactured.
and it's been towed in place.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? This gentleman here.
I've got something like planet, white, snowy planet.
White snowy planet.
Looks like a moon, but it has a ring.
Okay. Okay. Gentleman behind.
I said something very spacious, but also enclosed at the same time. Maybe like the greenhouses, it's got a lot of space in it.
Right, spacious but enclosed, like greenhouses.
Then also I had a sense of like a carpeted biosphere.
Biosphere type of thing. Okay. Lady back there. No, sorry, I'm visualizing a hand. It's an ectoplasmic hand. A saucer type shape. Okay. Okay. All right. Are you curious as what this was? Okay. This is the feedback. We've been hearing about the discoveries of Earth-like planets out in the solar system. So Kepler F681K is one of those, and that's what you were remote viewing. So when I gave this to a group in Crestone recently, they were coming up with a lot of Earth-like or Earth-type perceptions, and they said, well, obviously we're back on Earth, so we kind of suppress those perceptions. But we don't know yet if that's accurate or not. But if you're talking to anybody, I'm going to give a talk to the MUFON group tomorrow. Don't tell them what we perceived, okay? Because I'm going to give this to them as well and see what they come up with. So that's basically what you were remote viewing, was this Earth-like planet that's, a long way away from us. So we won't know for a long time if that's accurate or not, but it gives you an idea, that you can remote view something that's a great distance away. Maybe with not feedback at the moment, but who knows in the years to come. Now we have another minor little remote viewing here. This was gifted to the group. I don't remember who gifted it. Sorry? Juliana. Okay. Oh, this is by it's her book, Juliana Oka. One Life, Many Worlds. And inside here is a card with a number on. So I'm going to ask you to use your innate perceptions, your wonderful innate perceptions, to come up with a number. And I'm going to take a quick glance at the number because I want to see if you're going to be correct or not, and who is going to be correct. I can find it. Okay. So, who wants to offer a number? It's the person that's closest to the number gets the book. Really?
681.
Okay.
I'm the worst guesser in the world, but 58611 is what
Okay. What was the one back there? 81. 77. 77. 16.
Oh, we're doing the book giveaway?
Yeah.
71.
14. Come on, you guys. You got to use your remote viewing skills. 17.
Was that 57?
54.
52.
Okay, who said 52? Okay, you're the closest. No, we're getting, this is, the number's 53. So pretty good.
What's the number?
53. Well, that was just for fun. Just a fun thing. We can go one more. This is my contact information if you need to get a hold of me. If you have questions or comments or just want to be in touch. I have a website. I try and keep it up to date, put some new stuff on there. Yeah, I'm going to be teaching down in Delaware first week of November. And we're hopefully going to work on another book eventually called Faces of the Cosmos, which will be working, about interactions with ETs, Earth-based ETs, of which there are many hiding in plain sight. So that's still in the very formative stages, so it won't be for a long time yet. But we're open to some questions. This is Q&A.
So we've got a mic open right here. You guys can report how to do it. So just please try to limit your question to one question because there'll be people behind you. And keep it to a question rather than like a dissertation and a statement, okay? Let's just make it the question time, okay? Sorry to be rude about that. Let's see. Okay, come on forward, guys. Anybody got a question? I've got a question for you. Let's see. I got a bunch of questions.
Okay.
So we went right into a remote view, or we tried it, but we didn't go into a process. Is there any process that you do to prepare yourself mentally or like physically? Like, in yoga, you breathe, you relax, you center, you think of whatever. Is there a process that is described or that is ascribed to?
There are multiple processes. What I do is I go do all my chores and then I sit down in remote view. Some people say affirmations. Some people listen to hemisync biofeedback music or tones. Other people pray. Some people, like Paul Smith, listen to heavy metal music. We did this process very, very quickly. So it's not surprising if you didn't get anything, don't worry, because that was such a very, very quick process. And it would have been better, to have taken a bit more time, but we didn't have a great deal of time.
Okay. No questions, guys? Okay, come on up. I got one question before he does, though.
Oh, okay.
Just came to me as you were talking, sorry.
Right.
I'm sure you, when you were doing remote viewing with groups, you guys studied the process. Did you ever look at brain function during the remote viewing process, meaning are you in theta, alpha, beta? And is it synced? Does the group sync up?
Not with a group. I did some personal EEG work with a very simple process where I looked at my own brain waves with a friend's EEG equipment on the computer, looking at the differences between stream of consciousness remote viewing and CRV, the more formal remote viewing, and found that there were differences in brainwave function.
Your job sounds like a lot of fun. How much do remote viewers earn, and how many companies are there that employ them, say in the U.S.?
At the moment, there are hardly any companies that pay for remote viewing. Most of my viewers, we do humanitarian work, and we don't ask for any fee. So the viewers don't get paid for that. They just get paid for the kudos.
And are there a lot of companies that employ professional remote viewers?
There are. As I say, I had one client for 9 years. I've had other clients for 6, 7 years. But these are not clients that give me work every day, or it's not like a 9-to-5 job. It's whenever they have a problem, they will contact me, and I would do some work for them on an independent consulting basis.
Thank you.
Hello. You
Hi.
mentioned doing remote viewing on Amelia Earhart's flight.
Yeah.
So you're able to do that through time, both directions?
Right. When you're remote viewing, time is not important. You can remote view just as easily things in the past, the present, and with a little more difficulty in the future because of the multiple futures problem.
Do you have any, yeah, of course. Do you have any interesting stories about remote viewing into the future?
I have something that I do for myself in terms of future remote viewing is if I do a circular remote viewing. If I'm expecting a letter and I'm getting nervous about it, getting anxious about it, I ask myself, what am I receiving from the future? So usually it's, quit worrying, stop, just relax, it'll be fine. So when the letter comes in, eventually, I have to send myself back a message to the previous time to say, stop worrying, the letter's coming in, So there are quite a few future viewings that, it's problematic doing future remote viewing because of every decision we make changes the future. But I think when you remote view a particular future, it's this quantum mechanics thing, you collapse the wave and make that future more likely to happen. So I can't bring up any examples at the moment.
But you mentioned the viewing of the creation of planetary rings in the past. So that was actually the origin of the rings some millions of
Right,
years ago.
those were future viewings.
Oh, future viewing.
Yeah, because
okay.
they were done prior to the to the actual discoveries.
I see. Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Cool. Are you able to remote view the human body to detect subtle structural differences that might be important in the central nervous system or the musculoskeletal system?
I have done some of that work. It's not something that I do as one of my main skills. And remote viewers have to be very, very careful that every remote viewing I do of that kind of project, looking at somebody's illness or something within the human body, I have to put a disclaimer on it that this is my opinion only. Even though I'm a trained nurse and social worker, as well as having a PhD in psychology, I still have to put a disclaimer on my remote viewing work. Otherwise, I could fall foul of the AMA, which is a sad state.
Thank you. Because Western medicine, there's a lot of things they're not solving or they don't know.
Right.
See.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I can hear.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Was it just an audio representation that you were having, or did you additionally see or have visual representation of who you were communicating with?
In the beginning, it was never auditory. It was a perception only. In remote viewing, you get perceptions, and they come in as hearing like or seeing like, etc. Later, when I did some of the site visits, I was able actually to perceive, to see where they were living, what they were doing, etc., and to get a little bit more information. But it was never actually hearing the voice in my ears or my head. This was these were perceptions.
So when you say perception, it's sort of kind of like as you were communicating with whoever you're communicating with, you have, I guess, when you said perception, like it's sort of kind of like, for example, I'm just trying to get an idea of this, since I have never experienced what you are referring to. It's sort of kind of like if I imagine someone in my head, I'm having a conversation with that individual, or I ask that identity a question, for example, and I just come up with an answer that they answer me back with. In your case, are you saying that the answer that this identity answers you back with, is that how you perceive it?
It's something in between actual hearing and imagining hearing.
I see.
If you're remembering hearing somebody talk, and then actually hearing somebody talk. It was somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
It's close. Right, it's close. That's as close as I can
Come to the
come.
mic for questions, guys, if you want to ask more questions.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Of the major events that happened on the news, like, there's do you get like, do you always need to take the time to look, like the planes that disappeared, or a lot of things like that, or do you see right away what happened, or
Well,
it takes time, or?
Thing is, I can't remote view everything because I wouldn't live.
Yeah.
I have a life to live. There are occasions when I will get spontaneous perceptions about an event. I'll be watching something on television and I'll go, okay, I get the feeling this is the case. With the Malaysia plane going down, I saw it. I didn't see it going into the ocean. I was getting images of it landing in a green, tropical, wet kind of environment, like. Well, I don't know. Who knows? Yeah, but I said it was like Vietnam, but not Vietnam. It was off of a runway. The fuselage was damaged, but many other remote viewers came up with those same perceptions. So I was not the only one.
And do you see the reason why it was done that way?
No.
No.
No, because I really didn't take the time to go in and do a full session on it. Only my first perceptions.
Yeah, and what is it you have not done so far and that you would love to do?
Oh my gosh. I'd like to do some more work on Amelia Earhart, because we really don't know everything about what happened to her and her co-pilot and the plane. There are just so many projects that I'd like to do, but it's a matter of time and earning a living.
I thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, sir. Sir, come up over here. Go ahead.
I just bought your book back there, and I got the spreadsheet,
Yes.
and it looks fantastic. I really appreciate the work that went into that. I'm not sure that there's much physical description of a lot of the different entities. I was wondering if, did you contact very many human-appearing aliens?
The Nordics were the most human-appearing. The others, described themselves as cousins of the Greys, for example.
Okay.
So there was not a lot of physical description from all of them. Some of them were just wisps. Yeah.
And I noticed on your list all the barons,
Yeah.
which are famous through the Tula Society and the folks in Nazi Germany. I'm wondering if they addressed their relationship to
They didn't,
Nazis.
because unfortunately I was working with a set of questions that was supplied to me, both from my client and from the sociological surveys, plus my clarifying questions. So there were a lot of questions that we could have asked them and which we might ask them in the future. As you're saying about what kind of project would you like to do in the future, well, I'd like to go back and re-interview a lot of these races with new questions and other races as well.
And last question is, did you run across any particularly negative entities?
Yeah, the dark ones. Kind of attach themselves to humans. And the dark ones don't consider themselves negative. They say they're just feeding their children. But they feed on negative energy.
But you didn't feel that the reptilians were negative?
Well, the reptilians didn't want to be interviewed until I kept on saying, well, I want to interview you. Can you answer my questions? And so you'll see that they did answer some of the questions. They didn't answer some of them. And one of the things I asked them was, if you were to meet humans on board a craft, what would you do? And they said, well, we make a loud noise at them. And I said, well, if my clarifying question was, well, if that didn't move them, what would you do? They said, well, we would push them. And that gave me the chills.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Dr. Smith, thank you so much for an amazing book. I've read it in its entirety. So one of the big things that comes to mind is world peace, and a lot of the implications and what the different races have talked about with regard to whether or not and at what time we might be able to join the Confederation. So that gives all kinds of ideas, and I'm wondering if after you wrote these ideas, if you've generated other questions for looking at that, and also have you been contacted by people in the government and people that have been had worked with the $20 trillion and all the people with the original remote viewing. So I guess I'm asking questions of world peace. I'm asking of the next set of questions you've generated, and also the interest that you've had from government officials.
Right. Well, the first question is the world peace question, which my co-author, C.B. Scott Jones, talks about at length in the book. He is very concerned about world peace and about the weaponization of space. So he is very, very involved in groups that are opposed to the weaponization of space and to, bring in ET input into that question. I have been approached by one or two government folk, primarily to ask me what I'm doing. Is this an embarrassment to the remote viewing field? Because there are quite a few of the remote viewing folks who are still military and who think that this kind of work is an embarrassment to the remote viewing field. But they have not given me any additional questions. But one of my mentors, I'll put him as my mentor, that I approached when the book was coming out, and I said, this book is coming out, it's about ETs, it's about communication, it's about telepathy. I expected him to go ballistic, and he said, oh yeah, okay. And my jaw dropped, because there was an acceptance, and I wasn't expecting that. What was the second question?
You know what, I was just more fascinated because just so you know, I'm an adult and child psychiatrist with a very open mind, and I'm incredibly fortunate to be the doctor of many highly gifted intuitives, and I've also been asked to be part of some future universities that are going to be of the caliber of Harvard in sensory perception.
That's fantastic.
So I thank you for all the work you're doing and putting yourself out there. It's phenomenal. And I think one of the things I've just read, Dr. John Mack's book, and I was interested. It didn't seem as though in your book, with your communications, that a lot of discussion about the environment. It seems like a lot of the data from people, and I also want to respect all of you out here who've been experiencers regarding the concern for our environment that's been, when Dr. John Mack is a Harvard psychiatrist who, many of you know this, I apologize if I'm repeating data that you know, but he actually did a scientific method and has interviewed experiencers. Yeah. And a lot of the data that comes back, and if you look at things, has to do with the way we're taking care of our planet. So not only the kindness and all the good things we know, common sense with compassion of sentient beings, but how we're taking care of our planet. So it's interesting because that didn't seem to come up a lot in the discussions that you had with the different races. Yeah. So I was surprised.
Well, there were two aspects. The first is I was very confined by the questions I was given to ask. So by the time we'd asked all those questions, there wasn't a lot of time, or we didn't have the option or I didn't have the option to ask those kinds of questions. However, the ET responses that came back, they consider they cohabit the Earth. And they were here, they say they were here before us, they'll be here after us, and they'll just come and take what they want and need, regardless of what we do.
Correct. And another great book is Exoconsciousness by Rebecca Hardcastle, who's a PhD, if any of you are interested. And then one last thing, because I am an adult and child psychiatrist, the take-home point with the dark ones in your book was that you can ask them not to attach to you.
Right, you can ask
them to leave. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that.
You can ask them to leave. Yes, thank you.
How do they know they were here before or after us? When did we show up?
Well, they have verbal history. They have memory history. And that's what they told us and told me in the interviews was, you know, we were here before humans, we'll be here after humans.
Thank you. I know of serious psychic institutes that do psychic institute research like this at Stanford, at Duke, and the one that you mentioned at Princeton that you were a part of. Do you know many more institutes like this around the country? And what's our government doing with them?
Sadly, there are no known institutes now that are really doing this work.
They closed Stanford and Duke also?
No. Well, Duke is really doing the same stuff they've always done. Edinburgh closed down, Pear closed down. There were groups in Texas, they've closed down. PRL closed down. A lot of the funding dried up. A lot of it was black project money. I don't know if you know. Yeah.
So
it's McDonnell Douglas money.
Is the idea to constrain these programs and to maybe draw it into the government closer?
I think some of the programs have gone undercover, but I don't have any proof of that.
Do you have any idea what the government's doing after they kind of closed out, like we were talking about before, Pat Price, Ingo Swan, Russell Targ, and all these women?
I think some of the ex-military remote viewers are training others within the military, but what they do with it, I have no idea.
What do you think of the Monroe Institute and the HemiSync program they have to train remote viewers?
Well, I went out and did the Gateway program and loved it.
So you think, is that about the most effective training program that you're aware of?
Well, it's effective and it shows you how to use your mind.
And one last question. What do you really think of Ed Dames?
He loves drama.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.
How long is your typical remote viewing session, like when you're doing from time to time for the business, how long it takes in usual?
If it's a simple coordinate with a simple question attached, it will take me perhaps an hour to an hour and a half if I'm doing the CRV military method, which is the pen and paper, very sequential method, because that takes time. If I'm using ERV, where I can send my mind to the location and bring back information, then that can take as little as a half hour.
So it's shorter?
It's shorter, for stream of consciousness.
And then you write down the results after, right?
I usually give a report to the client, who then gives me feedback and either confirms or the information or asks for further information.
But when you send your mind, are you using like voice recorder to record what you're seeing at the moment, or
no,
do you write it down later?
If I'm doing CRV, it's all written down. If I'm using ERV, I cue myself to remember. I have a pretty good memory. So I cue myself to remember this, remember that, and I write it down as soon as I finish the project.
And are you using like 3-stage form or more stages for the written one?
For CRV, I use there's 6 stages. Yeah.
Thank you.
My question might be related somewhat to this, but you mentioned the use of coordinates. Where do those originate from? And do you need to use that on nearly everything, or do you have other methods?
There are other methods. The coordinate system came about through, at SRI, first of all, Ingo Swann, when he was doing his first work at the American Society for Psychical Research in New York, was saying to his colleagues there, why don't you ask me what the weather's like in Chicago and I'll tell you. So he would do that, and then they were doing outbounders where they were following people around in Manhattan. But those were known locations. When he got out to Stanford, they wanted to make it a little more professional, so they used actual geographic coordinates in the beginning.
You mean something like latitude, longitude?
Latitude,
or
longitude,
three-dimensional type of coordinates?
No, latitude and longitude. And then, like Ingo Swann would say, okay, well, what I'm perceiving is this island in the middle of a big expanse of water, and he would sketch it and draw the mountains and roads, etc., which proved to be very accurate. But then somebody, I think from the Geological Society, said, oh, well, if you gave me that coordinate, I could tell you where it is because I know all the coordinates, because they're man-made coordinates.
Yeah.
So what they did was they put the geographic coordinates into the computer, which came out with an encrypted coordinate, which was a random series of letters and numbers that they gave to the viewers, and they still hit their targets. So that's how the coordinate system came to be.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have you ever had any ET experiences independent and outside of the remote viewing communications which you had with them?
Yes, and I wrote a book about it called Diary of an Abduction, which is out of print, but you can find copies on the internet. And it was my quest to understand my own experiences.
Please expand.
Oh, well, that would take more time than I have.
Were you abducted?
What does it mean? That is a word.
Were you invited to go on a ship with a bunch of people?
Invited is different from being abducted.
Yeah.
When you're abducted, you're taken against your will or without your consent. Invited is a different thing. That's more of like an experiencer. I have a question for you, though. You've done this for a while. So, you know, as a scientist, for example, you can describe how light works, what it is, you know, what its properties are, what it does, how it functions, what you can expect from it. So given this fact, let's say, of remote viewing, how would you describe it in the physical world, or how would you say it works?
Remote viewing?
Yeah.
It's a normal ability that everybody has.
Okay, but that's just making it, I mean, I'm saying physically, how does it work? What is it about the human mind that allows it to jump through space and time and capture information?
Because we have 2 hemispheres of the brain. One half is very logical and grounded, numerical. The other half is very non-spatial and able to do non-logical things. So I believe it's to do very much with the non-logical right hemisphere. That's simplifying it greatly. But I think there are aspects of that right hemisphere that we don't know much about that need to be explored.
So are we more than, so is consciousness or the brain more like an antenna that kind of like captures consciousness or translates consciousness? In other words, does consciousness exist outside? We perceive consciousness inside our own heads, but does it actually exist elsewhere, and it's our brain that's sort of a translation mechanism for it?
That's the question of the century.
Oh, yeah.
But Ingo Swann said the whole body, the whole sympathetic nervous system is a coordinate, is an antenna.
Yeah.
It's not just the brain or the gut or the heart, it's the whole nervous system.
The whole being.
It's the antenna.
Okay, so then another follow-on question, mentioning targets. So the targets are given by somebody who actually has there is a person who has a question in mind.
Right.
So that is a consciousness with a direct, intent.
Right.
The intent is then just given to random coordinates, and then that random coordinates are given to the remote viewer. So is it the intent that the remote viewer is focused on or becomes focused on? In other words, do the coordinates have any relevance?
You can do a remote viewing without a coordinate. The intent of the tasker is very important. And usually what we ask the tasker to do is to write down very carefully what it is they want to know. For example, they could write down, well, I want to know where John Smith is next week. Well, what time next week? Where next week? So you have to be very specific in the tasking.
So the process would be that the tasker writes the question down in detail, puts it in an envelope, maybe seals the envelope, then given to a, I don't know, what do you call them, handler or coordinator?
Well, that depends. If you have a whole team, you can have a tasker, you can have a client, you can have a business manager, you can have an analyst, you can have viewers. But a lot of us don't work with those luxuries. So we have to educate our customers about how to prepare a project. Some clients like to, in fact, I'll give you an example. A couple in Australia wanted to task me. And they said, well, we'll just write out what we want. So it was 5 questions, with each of those 5 questions had 5 sub-questions. And each of those 5 sub-questions had another 5 sub-questions. So I had to send them back and say, sorry, can't work with that.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
All
Too
right.
overload.
Well, Angela, I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking with us tonight. And I'd like to invite the audience to meet you at your table. You still have just a few books left for sale. So if you could please, maybe she'll be kind enough to sign them for you if you guys want to see her and support her. Okay? Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next month, 3rd Tuesday of the month.
Thank you for inviting me.